Thank you for being here tonight. Welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Todd Arrington. I am the director here, and I've seen some of you at other events, and so it's nice to see some familiar faces, and I haven't met all of you yet, but I've been here for about the last 8 months, and I'm really happy to be here in Abilene and working at this wonderful facility and working with wonderful colleagues and doing some really important work here to tell the history of someone that I think is a giant in American history and really the history of the world. And part of that is because of some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'm pleased to have with me Dr. Jason Lantzer from Butler University in Indianapolis. He has written a number of books, all of which I'm sure are wonderful, but the one that really interests us here tonight is this one, which is called Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust. If you didn't know, today is actually Holocaust Remembrance Day, so that's why we decided to have this event on this day. Thursday nights maybe aren't always the most popular time for events, but we really wanted to do it on this specific day because of what an important commemoration today is. So this program tonight will be, I'll say, somewhat informal. It's not a formal presentation. I don't know if any of you were at the earlier program today that Dr. Lantzer did that was excellent. That's a more formal stand up behind a podium, which I know you really liked our podium. There's another one right there. If you want me to pull that over for you, I can do that.
We'll see how it goes.
But this is more of an informal, sort of a conversation between the two of us. And you all get to see that and listen. And of course, at the end, we will be happy to entertain questions that you might have. I'm assuming most of those will be for Dr. Lantzer and not for me, because he's the expert here. But we'll also, after the program, there'll be a few light refreshments in the back, and we encourage everybody to partake in those as well. So just as kind of a thank you for coming out and something nice for to hopefully get you through Friday and get you into a nice weekend. So I'll just, Jason, if it's okay, I'll just start asking you some questions.
Absolutely.
And we can kind of keep this again informal and free flowing. And we'll also at the end of the program tonight, if you're interested in a copy of Dr. Lantzer's book, we do have them for sale here, and if you buy a book, I'm sure he'd be happy to sign it for you, and I'll even let him borrow my pen if he wants to. So, okay, so Dr. Lantzer, the first question I thought maybe would just give people a little bit of background is tell us a little bit about what is your background as a historian? How did you come to this topic? Is this something that you always wanted to write about, or did you kind of come upon this almost by accident?
Sure. So I always loved history. It was my favorite subject from the time I was in elementary school forward. There was never any doubt that history was going to be part of my life. Growing up, when I did, not to date myself, but that was in the late 1900s, which is a weird thing to say, but that's what all my students are now referring to the 1980s and 1990s as. World War II was definitely a topic that was covered. It was, the lifeblood of the then History Channel when they did a lot of history programming, a lot of World War II documentaries. And so in that sense, American history, the Second World War have long been a part of what helped make me be excited about just learning about history. So fast forward, when I decide that I'm not going to law school, I'm going to go to graduate school, and I'm going to become a real life historian, not just somebody who likes history. And one of my professors in graduate school said, listen, with the job market the way it is, you have to be ready to teach anything at any time. And I said, that is music to my ears because I love it all. So I don't have to specialize on anything. I can just be an American historian. This is going to be awesome. Fast forward a little bit further. I've written some books. I've done really everything that I get to pick what I want to teach and what I want to write about. It's been a wonderful career. And then in about 2015 or so, at Butler University, we had a family give a very generous donation to start an undergraduate research fund in memory of two of their family members who had survived the Holocaust. And in the second year of that fund, one of my former students applied for the travel research grant and asked me to be his faculty sponsor. And I said, absolutely, happy to do it. He identified some records at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. that he really wanted to have copies of or to go and see himself, but couldn't balance that with the rest of where he was going as part of his research funding. He could do the big trip to Europe, or he could go to Washington, D.C., just from a time standpoint. And so I said, don't worry, I'm going out to D.C. anyway. I'll be more than happy to go and get these records for you. And so that's what I did. That's a long way of saying I loved history, and by happenstance, I ended up at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where, after getting those records for Isaac, I said, well, I think I'm going to do the tour. I'm here. I might as well go through the museum as well. And if you've ever been or you haven't been, I'm going to tell you how that tour begins. You get in an elevator, you go up to the top floor, you get off the elevator, and when the doors open, you are confronted with pictures of General Eisenhower at Ohrdruf, a concentration camp that he visited about a week after it was liberated. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that tonight. But you're also presented with a quote from General Eisenhower about after seeing it, what he wrote back to General George Marshall. That quote stuck with me throughout the entirety of going through the exhibit, thinking about what did Americans know, when did we know it, where have I seen that quote before, has anybody done anything with that quote? That quote is powerful, it's moving. What kind of impact did visiting the camp have on Eisenhower? All the sort of historian wheels were turning in my head. And so by the end of my stay in D.C., I mean, especially by the time I got home, I was looking in the back of all my World War II books. I went into the bookstore at the Holocaust Museum and was literally just flipping open to indexes to see, did they mention Eisenhower? Yes, great, where is it? Well, yep, there's part of the quote, or there's the whole quote. But nobody's doing anything more with that. And that triggered another memory, and that memory was of yet another professor from graduate school who said, part of your job as a historian is going to be digging holes, and part of it's going to be filling holes. This was a hole that needed to be filled. We needed to know, I needed to know, how encountering the Holocaust had impacted General and then President Eisenhower, and so that's what I set out to do.
Well, you mentioned a lot of things there that I could comment on about, growing up in the 80s and 90s. But I think probably the most interesting thing is that remembering that there used to be history on the History Channel. I don't know how we ended up with swamp people and all this other stuff on the History Channel. I remember the old World War II documentaries as well, and that was, frankly, part of what got me interested in history as well. And wanting to be a historian and not just a history buff anymore, as people still like to call us, but actual historians. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, so you mentioned Ohrdruf a couple of times in that first response. So American forces liberated Ohrdruf on April 4th, 1945. So we just passed the 80th anniversary of that important milestone. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, of course, in Europe, tours Ohrdruf on April 12th. Tell us a little bit about what kind of camp was Ohrdruf. And the reason I say that is I don't think people are maybe as familiar with Ohrdruf as something like Auschwitz or Dachau or some of the more famous camps. So what kind of camp was it? Who did they find there? What kind of terrible things were being done there?
Sure. So Ohrdruf is a small camp. It is a work camp. Its purpose was to have workers working on a largely subterranean communications center that never got built. The war happened too quickly for it to ever get anywhere near completion. It is a subcamp of Buchenwald, so one of the more famous, larger camps. Really what that means is it's not necessarily that close to Buchenwald, but administratively, things flowed from Ohrdruf up and down from Buchenwald, right? It's sort of the hub, if you will. In terms of who's there, it is, especially by the time the camp is liberated, a who's who of European nationalities. It was never a camp that was designated for any one particular group of people that the Nazis were persecuting. It was not necessarily a camp where they sent POWs. It was constructed for this work purpose, which meant when the Nazis sent people to the camp, it was because they looked like they were strong and could dig and do work until they couldn't anymore. So that's one thing. The other thing is that by the time the camp is liberated, the internal camp system, which included at its peak probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 or more different kinds of camps of varying sizes, was contracting exponentially as Allied armies were moving both from the east and the west and from the south, pushing up into Italy. And so the Germans were actually racing to keep their camp system intact and moving prisoners from one camp that was about to maybe come under Allied eyes and thus potentially liberation, and move those prisoners to camps that were further into the interior. And so the size of the camp grows in the first few months of 1945. You get even more people who are not there to work. They're just simply there because the Nazis are trying to keep those prisoners imprisoned. And so you now have even more people from more places, including by this time a segment of the prison population who are Jewish, who've thus far survived the camp system. And so it's a little bit of everybody, a little bit of every sort of nationality, ethnicity, religion, politics. They're going to encounter a lot. The American liberators are going to encounter a lot of different people from different parts of Europe.
I don't know how many people can visualize a map of Germany in their heads, but can you give us an idea where exactly is Ohrdruf?
So Ohrdruf is near the town of Gotha. Gotha is in the state of Thungaria. I know none of this is helping if you don't already have that mental map of Germany in your head, but it's sort of in east-central Germany. So almost in about smack dab in the middle of modern-day Germany today.
Okay, so April 12th, 1945, General Eisenhower comes into Ohrdruf with General Patton, General Bradley, a number of other folks. What does he see?
What he sees is a camp that has been officially liberated for about a week. The decision was made that because of the health of the prisoners and quite frankly, the poor conditions within the camp, that it was a potential, you didn't want these people leaving the camp. We needed to keep them, and this is one of those words that we became all too familiar with. We're quarantining these folks over the pandemic. Remember that word from the pandemic? Yeah, it's happening then too. The decision is made to keep the liberated prisoners actually in the camps to try and clean the camps up and to save these people because most of them are malnourished. Many of them have a variety of diseases, and so we don't want the disease to spread, but they are free. They have also now, we've kind of gotten over the hump of the people who were sick, and the reason that there are prisoners there to be liberated is because the Germans were fleeing ahead of the advance of the American forces. And so the people who are still there were people that were deemed too ill to be transported elsewhere. But the initial wave after liberation of people who grew increasingly, or who were already sick and were on the way to death's door, has sort of diminished a little bit. So the camp population is now stable to a degree, even if illness hasn't been completely eradicated by any stretch of the imagination. What Eisenhower encounters are these people who are free, but in some cases hundreds, if not 1,000 miles away from home. People who, and remember, the war is still going on. So it's not as if we could say, all right, well, you're free, you can go home now. The war is still raging. Germany hasn't surrendered yet. And so he encounters people who are free and yet who aren't really able to exercise their freedom, but also extremely happy because they know they're not prisoners anymore. They may be confined to the camp, but they're not prisoners anymore. And so it's an obvious signal to them, but also a very, it reinforces what Eisenhower has already come to believe by April of 1945. The war is essentially over, that we are on the verge of victory. And this now becomes this sort of obvious manifestation that what we were fighting for and against is coming to fruition. We are fighting to save these people, and we're fighting against a system that had enslaved them to begin with.
I just have to ask, how did the people who had been prisoners at Ohrdruf respond to being told, you're free, but you can't leave? What was the response to that? It couldn't have been positive.
It was, and this is a policy that's put in place at all the liberated camps. It begins for us as the Americans at Ohrdruf. There's definitely some pushback, but there's also a very quick acceptance that, wait, we're going to be fed, we're being taken care of, our medical needs are being met, and we're being told, you can't go home yet, right? The war is still raging. And so to be behind American lines, to be being taken care of by American medical and military personnel, at least for a time, it's acceptable. Now, one of the things that's going to happen very quickly, especially once the war is over, is that once the Germans surrender, is that we're going to start to see in various places a policy that goes into place in which prisoners are going to, the U.S. Army is going to requisition civilian housing, and prisoners are going to be moved out of the camps and into German homes, so that they're going to have an actual real bed and still be taken care of, but we're also going to know where these people are so that we can help them along the way.
So when Eisenhower goes into Ohrdruf on April 12th, does he see, what kind of evidence is still there of the true horrors of the Holocaust?
So there are obviously eyewitnesses, and he's going to talk to people through a translator mostly. There are very few English speakers within the camp, maybe a few words here and there, but most of them are going to be able to be spoken to via a German translator. There's the evidence, and Eisenhower is going to not just see, but demand to see essentially every square inch of the camp. When aides try and get him to leave after about an hour or so, he says, no, I have to get this. And what he meant was, I have to see everything for myself. I don't want somebody telling me what was here. I want to be able to say, this is what I saw. And so one of the things he's going to see are the various ways that the Germans would torture prisoners for whatever infraction that they may have been accused of. There's a simple sort of gallows system that wasn't for hanging, but instead, well, it wasn't hanging for death and strangulation. It was for hanging people. They would put your arms behind you, cinch them in some way with a rope, and then pull the rope up so that essentially they're dislocating your shoulders or getting right up to the point of dislocating your shoulders. Your feet would be dangling from the ground, and just at the point where, it was going to be the worst, and they were going to lose you as a worker, they'd lower you down, they'd allow you to recover, and then they'd haul you back up again. That apparatus is there. That's explained. There's sort of a pommel horse kind of thing, a table in a way, in which prisoners would be laid prone on, and then they could be beaten. There are various other torture implements that are still there. The Germans who fled don't take those things with them. They want out. They don't want to be captured at the camp. And then there are the bodies. Like virtually every camp within the system, the Germans eventually install a crematorium to cremate dead prisoners' remains. The crematoria had stopped working at Ohrdruf. In fact, part of the reason was the Germans had started to run out of coal or be able to get coal into the various camps. And so there was a backlog of dead bodies that were stacked up in various buildings or in a railroad car near the camp. This is where, famously, when General Eisenhower enters one of those buildings to see the body for himself, General Patton sticks his head in, sees what's inside, goes outside around the corner and throws up because he can't take the stench and the sight of all those bodies. There is also an improvised, for lack of a better term, funeral pyre that the Germans had created. They dug a ditch, they threw railroad ties soaked in petrol, and then thrown bodies on top, lit those bodies on fire, more railroad ties, more bodies. So there are these pits with ash and bone, and sometimes, especially at the top, bodies that hadn't been properly burned at all. So you've got arms and legs sticking up. And he sees all of this. There's no doubt that what happened in this camp is inhumane, is not normal, and as Eisenhower is going to quickly deduce and begin to argue, is apparently at the heart of what the Nazis were actually doing.
We have, in our museum, we have a great Eisenhower quote prominently featured that says, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can." I think that certainly speaks to the horror of seeing his own men, killed or horribly wounded. But I think in learning more about his experience at Ohrdruf and with the Holocaust as a whole, I think he probably was thinking of that as well when he made that statement.
I would tend to agree with that. This, for a man who dedicated most of his adult life to the service of his country, well, almost his entire life to the service of the country in one way, shape, or form, but for most of it being in the Army, he does come to see this war as, yes, necessary. He never really regrets the various orders that he gave throughout the war, but what he does regret is what those orders caused. But it's not, as I think he would argue, it was what needed to be done because of the situation we were in. And the people who actually sparked this are the people we're fighting against, the Germans, in the case of the European theater. And so when he sees the camps, when he receives more and more reports about the various kinds of camps and the sheer number of people that the Germans had imprisoned, and the initial estimates on how many prisoners had been killed, that are skyrocketing into the millions. When the war is over and he's able to step back and take a look at the bombing raids that he had ordered that were necessary, but the damage that had been done to German cities, reducing huge swaths of the country to rubble. When he realized or could again sort of step back out of the moment and say, yes, we needed to bomb that city that had important military targets in it, but not all those bombs fell on those targets. Civilians died. Were those women and children, for example, how guilty were they? Well, they were Germans and they supported the Nazis, but they're still women and children. They're still civilians. That's not what armies are supposed to do. They're not supposed to make war on civilians. And then I think just the sheer magnitude of the combat, we're talking about millions of men engaged in war for, in Europe, 6 years nearly. The sheer number of deaths on both sides, the decimation of populations, coupled with how the war ends in the Pacific. Not just with, again, millions of casualties, but the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. And how this kind of war, I think in Eisenhower's mind, a war that would produce the Holocaust in these camps and those atrocities and the fighting that had to be done to stop it, that's the kind of thing that can never happen again. And we certainly can't legitimize the use or regularize the use of nuclear weapons as just another weapon. Those can never be allowed to be used ever again, because the next war could end with the destruction of all life on Earth.
And so many of the issues that you're talking about there that go far beyond the Holocaust or concentration camps or even the war in Europe, you're bringing in the Pacific here as well. But so many of those things are issues that later were major issues during Eisenhower's presidency. And I think I would argue, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but are some of these things that you're talking about, these are the things that maybe really made Eisenhower want to be a president who presided over a period of peace and wanted to, even though he spent, as you said, a long period of his adult life in uniform, wanted to be remembered as a man of peace, not as a man of war. I think some of these things must have come into that calculation.
Yes. So I think when it comes to, and I should back up and say that was one of the driving factors for me in making this more than just an article, right? That I was going to write a book, was that it wasn't enough to just focus on that last month of the war, and maybe a little background on how do we get there, and then how does encountering the camps affect that because it really is just a month. It's April to May. Because Eisenhower, for him, his public service doesn't end on May 8th, 1945. And so the legacy of seeing the memories, of seeing the camps, of seeing all the destruction, of sort of realizing what this war has done is going to be with him when he's military governor of Germany for the first 6 months of U.S. occupation until November of 1945. It's going to carry with him when he comes back to the States, and then is running the Army as chief of staff, and then he's brought back in to help sort of bring NATO into fruition. And it definitely, and this is what really helped continue to pull me into doing the research and writing, he's president of the United States for 8 years. You can't have been the supreme Allied commander and not carry some of that memory with you when you become president and commander-in-chief. And so I think that his wartime experiences definitely shape his presidency, both in terms of his foreign policy as well as his domestic policies. It's also something that, as much as he is and he presides over a period of peace, and the Cold War does not break out into a third world war in the classic sense, it's not because Eisenhower simply pretends that everything is fine with the end of World War II. He wants to find other ways to combat authoritarian regimes, and he views communism, especially communism in the Soviet Union, as essentially another authoritarian regime. The flip side of Nazi authoritarianism is Russian communism. And so he's going to combat that, but he's never going to say, well, this involves a full-blown war. There are other ways to combat and to not just keep communism at bay, but maybe destabilize it as well.
Let's go back I should have done this already, and I didn't, but I think it's worth maybe, you mentioned the very famous quote from Eisenhower that is seen, I think, inside and on the outside of the building at the Holocaust Museum, if I remember correctly, in D.C. I found the quote in the book. Do you want to read the quote?
More than happy.
I think it's powerful on many levels. Not only talking about what he actually saw, but kind of why he thought it was important to see it.
So this is the quote. On April 15th, Eisenhower wrote his famed note to General Marshall. The most interesting, although horrible, sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to a German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw beggar description. While I was touring the camp, I encountered 3 men who had been inmates and by one ruse or another had made their escape. I interviewed them through an interpreter. The visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, where there were piled up 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation, George Patton would not even enter. He said it would get him sick if he did so. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda.
And it's mind-boggling, really, how forward-thinking I think that he was in this case, recognizing that these things are so horrible and so terrible and so hard to believe that people could do this to each other, human beings could do this to other human beings, that he foresaw the possibility that people would just say, "Oh, it's not true." You might maybe mention the fears about propaganda, especially as it relates to World War I as well.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why Eisenhower will go on a press offensive, bringing or asking and then facilitating more than one actual congressional trip, bipartisan from both houses. Members of Congress are brought over to visit the camps themselves. Because by the time he writes to General Marshall, he's now, having seen one camp for himself, he's asking his intelligence branch, do we know of any other camps? Have other camps been liberated? And the answer is yes. And so we're starting to piece together that this is not a one-off, this isn't some sort of aberration, this is a system. And so we're able to facilitate tours of multiple liberated camps. Newspaper editors are brought over. Members of the clergy are organized to bring over because Eisenhower wants eyewitnesses. He's also going to eyewitnesses who are civilians, who are at home. But he's also going to order American troops who, as they advance forward, and in the case of Ohrdruf, which is liberated by the 89th Infantry and the 4th U.S. Armored Division, they liberate the camp, they stay for about a day, and then they keep moving on. They're at the spearhead of the American advance into Germany. But there are other units following up, and Eisenhower is going to order those units, listen, if you're not actively engaged, you go visit one of these camps. I want the men to see what we are fighting against. The reason that this press offensive is necessary is because back home, there are a couple things that have been working against knowledge of the camps being really well known. One of those is the legacy of the First World War and propaganda, or what I tell my students is the nasty P word. Nobody likes propaganda. Propaganda is bad. Well, the reason we think of propaganda as bad is because of the 2 world wars. It's a very natural thing to try and get your message out, right? We now use other neutral terms like, oh, we're branding and we're trying to get our name out in front of people, or we're trying to get a message across. We're messaging. Oh, in academia, it's all about messaging, right? But propaganda is something that the government is doing, right? During the First World War, the United States, which is not involved from 1914 until 1917. We stay out of the war for nearly 3 years. But we are inundated with propaganda, most of it coming from Great Britain, who are telling American newspapers, filing reports of all the horrible things that the Germans are doing in Belgium, it becomes known as the rape of Belgium. The Germans are killing civilians indiscriminately. Probably the best known and most horrific one is that the Germans have raided orphanages in Belgium and are using children, they're burning children alive to get grease from their bodies to grease the wheels of their cannons and mechanisms. None of which was true. But Americans believed it because it was coming and it was in our newspapers, and the British said it was true, so it must be true. No, it was actually trying to convince the United States to join the war against these horrible Germans, right? And when we find out after the war that almost none of that propaganda was true or even based in fact, Americans this is gonna be one of the recoils, right? We don't want to be involved in another war in Europe. Part of it is because they lied to us to get us into this one. That is something that cuts across partisan divides. It is something that Americans on the coast and in the heartland all sort of agree to. Yeah, we got duped. I mean, maybe the war ended up being necessary, but the reasons we got involved, we were lied to. And so that's something that Eisenhower is very much aware of. He's aware of that legacy of propaganda, and he doesn't want that to carry forward something he's seen with his own eyes. This isn't propaganda. This is firsthand evidence. He wants all of these voices saying, no, this actually happened. And in part as well, it is very much forward thinking. It's not just in the moment. We know we're going to win the war by the time he visits Ohrdruf. The war in Europe is essentially over, except there's still a couple weeks left of fighting. But moving forward into the future, if we're thinking this kind of thing can't be allowed to happen again, that means we have to so inoculate ourselves into understanding that it did happen that we won't allow something similar to ever occur again. Because it's going to be easy. I think Eisenhower knew right away it was going to be easy as the years go on for people to doubt what they are told, just told. But it's much harder to doubt when you've got an eyewitness telling you, no, this is what I saw. And in some cases, in the cases of survivors of these camps, this is what I lived through. I lived, my family didn't. And the gathering of documentary evidence. And here, as weird as it might sound, we have to thank the Germans. The Germans left records. They didn't destroy them all. Some of the camps they tried to destroy as much as they could, but every camp that is liberated, there are at least some documents there. And better yet, the archives in Berlin, right? The governmental archives, where letters are sent back from the camps, that archive survives. And we get those records. So when Eisenhower's thinking that at some point someone might say, this didn't happen or this was propaganda, we've got eyewitness testimony and we've got documentary evidence that it did happen. And not only that, and this kicks off with his visit to Ohrdruf as well, we've got photographic evidence. One of the nice things about having essentially the top 3 American generals in the European theater show up to visit a camp is it comes with its own press entourage. And so we have wonderful documentary evidence, not just photographs, and there are a bunch of photographs, both official U.S. Signal Corps, U.S. Army photographs. You can watch Eisenhower's jaw tighten. You can see it in his face. You can see him with his hands on his hips looking in disbelief. See him with his hands behind his back as he's walking and just trying to take in what he's seen, but also film. There's a Signal Corps cameraman with a movie camera there. And so we have documentary evidence on that end too. And Eisenhower is going to order that not only are the prisoners to be taken care of, now former prisoners, the liberated people who we're soon going to call displaced persons, DPs. Not only are they to be taken care of, but every camp that we liberate we need to gather up as much evidence as we can at each and every one of them. We need to do interviews. We don't often talk about, within the historical profession, when did oral histories begin? Well, this was a big moment in oral history because we're interviewing these inmates, these former prisoners, and we're asking them, who are you? Where are you from? What was your experience in this camp? Wait a minute, you were in another camp? And we're building this documentary evidence of what we're going to refer to as the Holocaust eventually, especially in terms of Jewish prisoners. We're assembling this, not just for the immediate post-war period with the International Military Tribunal trials, but for people living today.
So many questions, but I want to make sure we give the audience time to ask questions as well. I guess now moving forward again to his presidency, you did touch on some of the things like how this affected his view on the Cold War and the possibility of nuclear war and these kinds of things. So I'm curious, based on what he saw at Ordruff, did he visit any other camps or was?
So that's a wonderful question. My answer is no, not during the remaining weeks of the war. There is going to be in the future, especially once oral histories are conducted really in the 1980s of veterans, there's going to be discussion that, oh, I saw Eisenhower at Buchenwald, for example. They probably actually saw his son John. John, who comes to visit his dad, is in camp with Ike shortly after Buchenwald is liberated, and Eisenhower sends John to go see Buchenwald for himself. They remember when Eisenhower was there. They do kind of they have a striking family resemblance to one another. Just one is a little bit younger at that time. But they're both in uniform, and it's a natural mistake. After the war, he will visit some of the displaced persons camps in the American zone of occupation, especially two of the camps that are now, by the fall of 1945, Jewish DPs are being assembled into camps of their own. And so he will visit two of those camps, which gives me one of my favorite stories is when he visits one of the camps. Of course, he's the former Supreme Allied Commander, the current military governor of the American occupation zone. There's going to be security. They've set up machine gun emplacements to protect him. And when Eisenhower gets out of the car and looks around and sees these machine gun posts, and he's visiting a camp that has walls and whatnot, full of people who have been interned for the past 5-6 years. He orders the machine guns taken down. He says, "I have no enemies here. I only have friends." And it's a powerful moment. If you read accounts of the DPs who were there, this sends out sort of a wave of cheers that Eisenhower called us his friends. So it directly impacts in that sense that he's got this past experience and post-war experience, especially with Jewish DPs, that he's come and visited them specifically. But beyond that, when it comes to his presidency, the war, and you can't separate, I don't think you can separate the Holocaust, the camps, Eisenhower's encounter with both of those, and how he views the war. To him, they're part and parcel of the same thing. And so it does impact how he comes to view, for example, the newly created in 1948 State of Israel. So from a foreign policy perspective, it's going to lead to Eisenhower, towards the very end of his presidency, the Israelis are going to find Adolf Eichmann one of the real architects of the Holocaust. He's escaped justice thus far. He's living in South America. The Israelis are going to snatch him off the street and bring him to Jerusalem to stand trial. Eisenhower's going to order all American documents related to Eichmann to be turned over to the Israeli prosecution. He's also going to run interference when there's resolutions in the United Nations that Israel had done this, and the United States is going to speak out like, yeah, they did it and they probably shouldn't have, but also it's Adolf Eichmann. He's a bad guy. He should have been prosecuted 15 years ago for his crimes. But there are other things that the war impacts Eisenhower in big and small ways. So, for example, Eisenhower is really, if you think of the 20th century, he's really one of the first presidents in the 20th century. And remember, he's president in the 1950s, so half the century's gone by, to really push for civil rights for African Americans. And a lot of that has to do with his experience during the war with African American troops in Europe. It's also, and this is, well, I mean, we're all benefits of the Eisenhower interstate highway system. But that is something that also it actually impacts from, it comes from his experience out of both world wars. So, of course, he sees the Autobahn system after World War II and says, well, that was probably pretty nice. We should probably have one of those. But the reason he thinks it's pretty nice is because following World War I, and the museum has a really nice display of this, he was part of a cross-country motorized caravan that moved American military equipment from the East Coast to the West Coast on roads that sometimes didn't actually exist. But I've always loved that story, that several week trip, because of what it meant later on. And this goes to Eisenhower and memory and his presidency. One of the places he stopped, where the caravan stopped, was in my home state of Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the caravan usually stayed in a community overnight, maybe a day or two, made some repairs, got more supplies, moved on to the next place. When Eisenhower was campaigning for president in 1952, one of his train stops is going to be in Fort Wayne. And the way presidential train campaigning would work is you would get the local, in this case, Republican dignitaries from Fort Wayne would come to the stop previous to Fort Wayne. They'd get on the train. They'd spend maybe an hour with candidate Eisenhower. And then when they would arrive in Fort Wayne, there would be a big celebration, for example, and they would already be on the train, and oh, look, our mayor is standing there with the Republican. Oh, isn't that great? Yay, all right, big party, celebration. Eisenhower would say a few words, those guys would get off, another delegation get on, they'd move on. Well, on the train ride from wherever they were coming from, probably in Ohio, into Fort Wayne, Eisenhower begins asking these Fort Wayne Hoosier Republicans, hey, is so-and-so's cafe still open in your city? Is his garage still there? And they're like, how does he know who these people are? Like, he's really been briefed on our community, right? Because this is 35, 40 years removed from, well, not quite that far, over 30 years removed. How does he know this? And they're thinking, he must have really, no, he remembered from his time in the caravan. But he really remembered was we didn't have roads to get anywhere, and we needed those. So the war impacts his presidency in all sorts of interesting ways.
And the 70th anniversary of the interstate highway system is next year. So we might be doing a little something about that next year, too. So you'll hear more about that as we move towards 2026. I know you did research here while you were working on the research for this book. So why don't you tell us how wonderful everything is here and how great the staff is? And why don't you...
Everything is wonderful here, and the staff is fabulous.
Perfect.
I will say that part of my research for this was definitely impacted by that little pandemic we went through 5 years ago. on a couple levels. One was I had a draft of this book that I literally printed off in early March, and I wasn't going anywhere over spring break that year, so I was going to work on this draft during spring break. And it was over spring break that we went into lockdown. And I tried on one of those early days. I was like, well, I'm not going into work. We're not sure what's going on. I guess I'll work on this. And I couldn't do it. I don't know if you may have picked up on this, but the Holocaust is a pretty heavy topic to do research on and to be spending your time on. And when you're in lockdown in a pandemic, it's not the best mental space to be in. So I put it aside. But when I started picking things back up again, I reached out to the Eisenhower Library and I said, hey, I need these documents. And again, this is right at a period where we're not traveling, but that the staff was at least, there was somebody in the archive, and they needed something to do too. And so I remember to this day, I said in my message, I'm more than happy to pay for the copying of these documents, if that's possible, the scanning, whatever. Just let me know what the bill is. And I got a packet in the mail, and the letter said, don't worry about payment. And I thought, man, I like Ike. And I like the people who work with this guy. Because it really was this wonderful treasure trove of stuff that if I was able to come here, I would have been able to look at in person, but instead somebody took the time to find and scan it and send it to me. Plus, I still like getting mail, so it was an exciting day because it was a big envelope. And it wasn't a bill. There was no bill inside. And that's one of my fondest memories of this project in terms of the research, but just getting to spend time with Ike. I have this, it says I still like Ike button. And I'll share this story, which has nothing to do with research, but gets at my affinity for the general, as he liked to be called after he left the presidency. He was a general again. I was wearing this button. I'd done some interview, some podcast or something one morning in my office, and this happened this fall, so we're in the midst of a presidential election cycle. You may remember that too. It was not contentious at all. And that afternoon, I had a Zoom meeting with a couple student leaders and our provost at Butler. And so we started the Zoom meeting. I had a suit coat on. Wasn't quite as fancy as tonight, but had a suit coat on. But I had the button because I'd done the interview in the morning, and it was like, we're talking about Eisenhower. I should have my Ike button on. And my provost said, Dr. Lantzer, is that a political button on your lapel? And I said, yes. And she said, I said, it's an Eisenhower button. And she goes, okay, that I'll allow. And we had a laugh about it. I was like, I would hope that liking Ike would be okay.
He's not running that.
He's not running. Yeah, he's not up for election. So, and we still laugh about it when we see each other in the hall. If I've got the button up, she's like, oh, there you are campaigning again. But yeah, my affinity for Eisenhower. In fact, when the book was coming to the end, when I was really waiting for publication, I really thought, well, we're going to hit all sorts of anniversaries with this. That'll be great. Hopefully there'll be opportunities to go speak at places. Oh, look, here we are. But also, I thought, boy, maybe somebody, when they read this, they'll pick up on leadership or something like that'll be the sort of message, that this is the kind of leader our country has produced in the past and the kind of leadership that we might still need in the 21st century. Of course, a lot of other things happened around publication that have made it more relevant, especially on a day like today where it's Holocaust Remembrance Day. But I still like Ike a lot.
Well, it won't surprise you to learn that we agree. In fact, you know, we those of us that work here at the library, of course, we are federal employees. We are employees of the National Archives and Records Administration. We are in no way ever going to talk politics with people, but every now and then somebody will try to draw us into a conversation about, you know, about something. And our sort of standard response, but I think is also a really good one, is, well, I think we could all agree that wouldn't it be great if we had another Eisenhower? And so that's how we both promote Eisenhower's legacy, but also avoid actually talking to people about politics. So with that, I think it's a good time to transition into letting you folks ask some questions if you like. We've got someone coming around here with a microphone. So if you would like to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you and you can ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Bonnie. How do you view Holocaust deniers? Is that something you can
That's something I am more than happy to answer. I don't think they live in reality. And I think Eisenhower predicted that we would see these people arise. I think one of the things that we run into today, and again, I think this is Ike's foresight that this could happen and maybe would happen, is that we have reached the point where those eyewitnesses that were so important in 1945, we're running out of those eyewitnesses. Time has passed. And it becomes incredibly easy to say, well, who's telling me this? It's in some book, right? Well, books, anybody can print a book. And I think that's a place where we find ourselves in the 21st century, is as wonderful as things like the internet and social media are, right? As platforms that everyone can have a voice, everyone can have a voice. And because everyone has that sort of wonderful individualistic ability to speak their mind, but we also have the ability to only listen to people we want to listen to. And so that sort of echo chamber where this is what I'm saying, and wait a minute, I'm going to listen to this guy and I believe, well, that sounds totally plausible, right? Without any facts, without doing the research. I think that's why the collection of documentary evidence is so very, very important today. Because we are hitting at this point where Holocaust denial is something that 10 to 15 years ago, I think everybody thought this was a settled issue. We're done with this. We don't have to talk about it anymore. That's always a dangerous trap, right? When you think you don't have to tell people that something happened or something was bad, like, oh, everybody knows that. Well, no, everybody doesn't know that, or everybody doesn't want to accept that. And I think the further we get removed from World War II, the more important it is to remind ourselves and our children and our children's children that no. At this time, at this place, these horrible things happened, and they weren't done by monsters. They were done by other people. And if it happened once, it could happen again, and our job is to make sure, as Eisenhower really charged us, to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Other questions?
Is there any idea about how many of these sub-work camps there were around the areas that were occupied by the Nazis?
So it's one of those things. There are historians. This is again a product of our documentary evidence and the continued interest in the topic. The number of camps of some size, of some variety, probably is in the neighborhood of several thousand, maybe as high as 6,000 camps. Now, there are also places that throughout, especially Germany, where forced labor is utilized, not in a camp of 1,000, but in an individual worker being dispatched to, say, a farm to take part in. Should we count that individual worker as a camp? No, but it is an instance of forced labor. This gets into the academic debates of, well, right. It allows us to publish articles and write books and to have this sort of discourse. What matters to me is that this is ubiquitous within the Third Reich. It's how the Germans are able to stay, on some level, stay in the war for as long as they do, because when you think about it, you have the British Empire, you have the Soviet Union, which is essentially the Russian Empire under new management, and you have the United States. Three large countries, empires, however you want to look at it, huge economies, large numbers of people. Any one of them is equal to Germany, if not bigger than Germany. But you've got three big ones against one Germany. You also have a Germany that is never embraces the idea of total war. Hitler does not want to destabilize the home front by scaring people into saying, hey, we might need to have women go work in factories for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that causes is a problem, because you are taking millions of German men out of the workforce to go fight in the armed forces. You are also eliminating millions, hundreds of thousands at the very least, of pre-war German citizens who you have deemed as undesirable, and you're putting them in camps. You need workers. So where do those workers come from? Forced labor from countries that the Nazis occupy. The German war machine, especially from about 1943 on, functions in large part because of a forced labor system that the camps are part and parcel to.
Other questions? Don't be shy.
Okay, now before we go to these two questions, this side?
You're falling behind.
Yeah, you're falling behind. This is just like in class.
I'm not for sure if this has to do with what your studies were, and research. But and I understand that once Eisenhower went into the camps, he got support for the prisoners that were there. What happened after that? How did they get integrated back into society? How did they get back into their homelands? Because they were from so many different countries.
It's an excellent question. So the displaced persons camps are going to be a fixture throughout the 40s and really in some places into the early 1950s within Germany and Austria. And it's going to take time, in part because there is this sorting out. And Ohrdruf is this wonderful microcosm of all these different people from all these different countries have been thrust into this camp system, and here they are. And how do we get them home? Well, during the war, we can't move them back because the war is still going on. Once the war comes to an end, we can start thinking about, okay, well, we can send these people home. But there are a couple of things that then start to factor in. One is, do they have a home to return to? The answer is often no, they don't. Do they want to go back? If you were taken by the Germans, say, from someplace in Eastern Europe, you might not want to go back. In part because maybe your former friends and neighbors helped round you up and send you into the camps to begin with, so why would I want to go back there? And then this gets into the third area. Eastern Europe is going to be under, most of Eastern Europe will be under the Soviet zone of occupation. None of those countries were communist prior to the start of the Second World War. The Soviets are going to install, over the course of about 7 years or so, communist or pro-communist or at least pro-Soviet communist governments in virtually all of Eastern Europe. Many of the people who are in the camps are not pro-communist. And so you get a large group of, for example, Poles who don't want to go back to Poland that is going to be under Soviet occupation. Not only because of communism, but because they remember that in 1939, the Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, and about 6 weeks after Germany had invaded Poland on one side, the Soviets invaded Poland on the other side. So there's no love lost. They don't want to go home. They don't want to go back if they're going to be forced to go live under a communist government. That all has to be sorted out, because initially the Allies agree any displaced persons are to be sent back. But suddenly you've got people saying, if I go back, I'm probably going to be arrested and put in jail or killed outright. I don't want to go back. And one of the things that Eisenhower has to navigate as the U.S. military governor of the occupation zone in southern Germany is, am I going to send these people back or not? And in a couple of cases, he figures out ways to drag his feet so that he doesn't have to send those people back, and can convince, excuse me, and can convince Washington they shouldn't go back at all.
Other
Next question.
Yes.
I just have a question.
Oh, hold on. Let's
What is the root cause of
get you the mic.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
From your perspective, what is the from your perspective, what is the root cause of anti-Semitism? I know that Hitler used this and so forth, but you know, what causes this? Why is it so widespread, especially today? Do you have any insight as far as the Germans used it, but what's at the root cause, and how did they use it? I guess that too.
I can get into the how the Nazis used it much easier than I can explain anti-Semitism. That's in some respects above my pay grade, and not my area. I will say that it has there are flashes in a long history of anti-Semitism within Europe and to a degree into the United States as well in certain circles. It often has to do with perceptions, usually misperceptions of the role that Jews play wherever we're talking about in terms of economic life or political or social life. There's a religious element within certain areas as well, in which at certain times various Christian churches have labeled or accused Jews of being, for lack of a better term, the bad guys in the New Testament, even though Jesus was Jewish. It's a whole other area and discussion in religion, which we're not going to get into tonight either. But really what I think a lot of anti-Semitism within Germany boils down to is the Nazis are able to utilize the Jews as the other. We can project, and this is something humans do, we want somebody to blame for things. Oftentimes because we don't want to accept what's happening before us, we want an excuse, we want someone to blame. And in the Nazi case, what they're able to do is make an argument that many of the leading Jews in Germany are sympathetic to the Social Democrats, and that means they're just a step away from being communists. Communism is bad, thus people who support communism and socialism are bad, and Jews support socialism, and thus they support communism. This is a big moment in post World War I Germany, there is a belief that the German army was still viable in fighting World War I, and that they were, quote unquote, stabbed in the back by politicians, many of whom are social democrats and in religion or in culture are Jewish. They are the ones who forced the Kaiser to abdicate. They are the ones who caused us to lose the war. They are the ones who accepted the Versailles Treaty. They are the ones to blame. Now, the ultimate irony in all this is that Jewish Germans make up about 1% of Germany's population. They do not control the government. They do not control the economy. But boy, if you want someone to blame for what happened at the end of the war, or maybe for the crashing of the economy and the mismanagement of the Weimar regime, Hitler's offering you somebody. He's pointing. He's saying, look, they're the cause. We get rid of those people, and they aren't even people, he's going to eventually argue. If we get rid of the Jews, life's going to be so much better for us.
It seems like such a huge effort. You mentioned about Germany being on two wars at the same time. You know, fighting two battles. These things, two battles at the same time. It just seemed like they put so much effort into eliminating the Jews. You know, that kind of weakened them as far as the war was concerned. It just, you know.
It's a commitment to an ideology that trumps the logic of military necessity. So for those, I talked a little bit about this earlier today at the luncheon, and for those of you who weren't there, let me bring you up to speed. The Germans are essentially fighting two wars during the Second World War. One is the external war, the one against the Allies, the military war. The other is against Germany's enemies, as Germany defines it within the Reich. Those enemies are Jews, top of the list, communists, right up there, socialists, right there, anyone that the Nazis would label as undesirable, people with long-term diseases, the Roma and Sinti, people who were once referred to as gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics who oppose the Reich. We can say broad brush Protestant, but in the German context, Lutherans who opposed the Nazis. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The Germans had no problem, the Nazis had no problem labeling groups as problems. And the argument within the Nazi hierarchy is we have to fight both wars in order to win the total war. Right? The total war is not just the Lebensraum, the living space of conquering and creating a continental European empire. We've got to make Germany pure. We have to get rid of all these elements that have been holding us back so that we can have an empire that will last for 1,000 years. And when the military war goes south, and you can point at various points in time as to when the Germans should have probably realized they weren't going to win the war, but they kept fighting anyway. And wherever you decide that that's the moment where there's no turning back, they've lost the war militarily, they still keep fighting the other war. And in fact, it becomes almost an obsession within Adolf Hitler in the bunker, is that, you know, as he's under the Reich Chancellery, the city's being bombed, the Soviets are encircling the city, we still have to kill our enemies. Because they're the ones who really caused this war. Hitler loves to blame other people, right? And so we have to make sure that they aren't around. At the very least, we will have done that. But then in the end, too, Hitler starts to argue that the German people weren't ready for his brilliance, and they probably don't deserve to survive either. And it's so hopeless that he's not going to bother to try and survive. Also because he doesn't want to be put on trial. But again, that's a story maybe for another time. Any other questions?
Anyone else? There we go. One more brave soul.
Come on this side. We've heard from nearly everyone over here. I'm kidding, but not really.
We had the Germans and the Japanese had spies in this country. The Allies had spies in Germany. And during the bombing of Germany, the prisoners in the concentration camps would watch the bombers fly overhead, hoping that they would get bombed and maybe part of them would survive. But they never were. I think one maybe got one bomb, but they never were, and they were hoping. And of course, they were being killed every day, and so their population was getting smaller, and they're just hoping for some survival of any kind. I always thought that was interesting that with all our spies, with the partisans in the outskirts living in the woods, they knew what was going on in the concentration camps, but it apparently never made it to the Allied head.
Yeah, there's no lack of evidence, even in the midst of the war, about the camp system. We knew about the camps. The Germans weren't shy in the 1930s about the fact that they were constructing camps and rounding up people. They claimed, for example, I think when Dachau opened, that this was a place where they were going to re-educate people, and then they would be, returned to German society. But it became evident very, very quickly that those people, oh, I saw what you did there, sir. Became evident very, very quickly that these people, most people weren't being released from the camps, that they were interned and then in prison. I think as the war goes on, definitely if you're a prisoner in the camps, you are hoping against hope on some days that something will happen. That you'll be liberated, yes, that you'll survive, definitely. And then you start seeing those Allied planes, and sometimes they're flying low enough you know they're not German planes. You can see that big star on the wing. You know that's not a German plane, and somebody might say, I think that's the American emblem. Are they coming for us? Are they going to do something for us? And I think it's important to remember that while we've got a trickle of, and sometimes it seems much more like a flood, especially, as a historian 80 years removed, and you can see all the evidence because it's been wonderfully compiled by archivists and put in folders that say this, that, and the other, right? We sometimes forget that those initial documents are often coming in one at a time or piecemeal. The other thing I think is important to note, and this was one of the very first questions that I ever answered about this line of questioning. Someone asked why we didn't do anything about the camps in 1942. Why did it have to be 1945? And the simple answer is we don't have boots on the ground in 1942. We are nowhere near someplace like Gotha or Dachau or Buchenwald or on the Soviet side of things, Auschwitz in 1942. So until we're there, the sort of academic exercise of why we didn't do anything about, say, Auschwitz in 1942, is because we're not able to do anything about Auschwitz in 1942.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, other side, excellent.
I was really curious, before the war or the early periods there, we wouldn't let the Jews come over in the United States. I mean, we blocked ships and sent them back and did all that kind of stuff. After the war and these people that are displaced, did some of them come to the United States? Did a lot of people immigrate at that point? Did we change the way that we dealt with that, or just what happened in that? I really don't know anything about that.
No, that's a great question. So, immigration quotas that are in existence prior to the war are really set in the 1920s, and they are largely based on nationality. There's no provision, by and large, for any sort of persecution. We are taking X number of people from country Y, and that's it. And so when we get to the Nazi period, right, the 1930s, and people are attempting to immigrate, many of them Jews, attempting to get out, and they're having to fill out documents. Why do you want to leave Germany and come to the United States? And remember as well, there's one other factor in all this. The Great Depression is still going on. And so Americans aren't exactly opening the doors to people that, well, we don't have work here for 25% of our citizens. Why are we bringing more people in? Well, why do you want to move here? Well, I'm being persecuted. Yeah, well, no, like that's not a reason for you to move to the United States. Well, actually, it's a really good reason to move to the United States, but no. Or conversely, I'm sorry, we've already reached the quota for Germans this year. Oh, well, so do I go on? Well, you'll have to reapply for next year, and we'll see what happens. Okay. So that's in place, and by and large, the Roosevelt administration is following the law. Now, you're going to get people, especially as war becomes much more evident, there are going to be American consuls who are going to start bending the rules as much as they can. Bend, don't break, right? We're going to get people out if we can. Oftentimes, it's easier prior to 1939, especially if you're, say, a German Jew. Well, I'll just move to, say, France. Well, that works great until 1941, when France falls. Right? Or why would I move to America? I can just go to Holland. Again, 1941. Suddenly the Germans have followed you there, right? Post-World War II, there's a recognition that maybe that immigration stratagem wasn't the best one. And so a lot of displaced persons, not just Jews, but a wide variety, especially of Eastern Europeans, come to the United States. We open the doors. If we're going to bring it back to Eisenhower in this, I'll bump us up a little bit to 1956. In 1956, the United States helps inspire an uprising in Hungary against a communist government. And for a brief period of time, it looks like Hungary is going to break free of the Iron Curtain. And then the Soviets roll tanks in, and that comes to a close, and over 100,000 Hungarians flee. Many of them ending up in Austria or into West Germany. And the question becomes, what are we going to do with these people? We kind of caused this uprising, we, the United States. We have a responsibility to these people on some level. The Eisenhower administration certainly argues that we do. And Eisenhower is going to not just push through changes in the law, he's going to use his power as commander-in-chief to say, yeah, we're going to militarily lift these people out, we're going to bring them to the U.S. And not only that, not only are we sort of rectifying this past mistake from the 1930s by helping these people get out, but Eisenhower brushes off the old, I know how to utilize the press, right? The same kind of strategy he used post-Ordruff. So he is going to arrange, the administration is going to arrange, for example, and this I talk a little bit about this in my book because I talked to a Hungarian immigrant. He was a child when his family fled in 1956. But they were brought to Indianapolis. Not only were they brought to Indianapolis because they had an uncle who was already in Indianapolis, But their journey from the camp, I think in Austria, to the American heartland, was covered by Life magazine. They were on the front cover. They had a huge pictorial spread about what life was like in the camp, and then moving to Indianapolis, and the dad getting a job, and them having a house of their own, and everything. Why? Because Eisenhower wanted to personalize it. These aren't 100,000 refugees that we're taking in. It's this family that's got a little kid just like yours, right? And you can see how happy they are to be here in their house. Don't we want that? Yes, we do. Does that make up for what happened in the 30s? No. But is a change brought about because of Eisenhower's experience? Yes.
So with that, I think we're going to close it out. I would like to say a few things. First and foremost, thank you to Dr. Jason Lantzer for being here all the way from Indianapolis for 2 programs today. So we really put him to the test today, but he did a great job. For everyone else, I want to let you know a couple of things that you can do if you're interested in knowing more about this topic and the things that we've talked about here tonight. Of course, it's the 21st century, so the first thing I'll say is follow us on social media, at Ike Library, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. This program tonight has been recorded, and it will be put up on our YouTube channel shortly. So if you want to see that, you can also see the program that Dr. Lantzer did earlier today, if you want to check that out as well. We also, in honor of Dr. Lantzer being here and it being Holocaust Remembrance Day, we do have some things displayed in our museum, some documents from our collections here that are some of the ones, in fact, that he used in his research. So another day, because the museum is not open at 8:30 at night, sorry. But another day, please feel free to come back and go through the museum because, one, it's a great museum. And it tells the story of someone that I think everybody likes, Ike, and I think they like him more and more the more that they learn about him, whether it's through programs like this or reading books or visiting this museum. So you can come back and see some original documents on display. And then the other thing I'll mention is PBS Kansas City, and I don't know if people anyone in Abilene gets PBS from Kansas City, does have a new documentary coming out on May 15th called Winning the War, and it is really an examination of how 2 guys from the Midwest, 150 miles apart, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, are these 2 major figures in bringing World War II in Europe to a close. So it will be aired on PBS Kansas City that day. We are looking to have maybe a screening of that here shortly thereafter. So if you don't have PBS Kansas City, we are going to try to show it here fairly soon after it premieres. And so keep an eye on the social media channels and the newspaper and all that for press releases and things like that. So you can check that out as well. So at this point, we invite you to go to the back and enjoy some food and drink if you like. Dr. Lantzer will come over here to the table, and if anybody wants to ask more questions or buy a book and have him sign it, you can do that as well. But otherwise, we thank you very much for coming. Hope you enjoyed the program.
I'm supposed to show you my socks.
Yes. Yes.
These are my I Like Ike socks, which
Yes.
I purchased out in the
And they are available in the gift shop. So, yes, if you would like to buy a book, you also have to buy the book out there. So while you're there, why not pick up some socks or a button or something like that? So you show off your Ike pride. And all kidding aside, I hope there is a lot of that here in Abilene, because to have a facility like this in your hometown and a library that talks about the history of someone that I think I said at the beginning that I think is one of the crucial, most important figures, certainly in the 20th century and really in all of American history. I hope that's a point of pride for all of you that this place is here in Abilene. We certainly love being here and we love to be part of this community, so we hope you feel that as well. So with that, thank you.
Interstate 70, just 2 miles.
Yes, and let's see, who was the president that signed the interstate highway? Oh, that's right, Eisenhower. And you heard all about that tonight.
I could take it all the way home if I wanted.
That's right. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the evening. Please take part and buy books if you would like. Thank you for coming.